Or is it?
David? No.
Wait, you want a clicker?
If you have an extra one.
Yeah. I'll be right back.
Like a USB kind of. Thought I was smart taking it out earlier this week since I had a couple days with no presentations, but not smart enough to put it back in.
So how long are you in town?
I'm in the San Francisco area until tomorrow. Tomorrow night. Yeah, it's a little. I got here over a week ago.
Okay.
Last week I preached in Fresno, a small Presbyterian church out there. And then in the U.S. until the end of January. We'll go back to Korea at the end of January.
So tomorrow your flight is not to Seoul, it's to another.
To Philadelphia.
Okay.
Yeah. That's kind of our home base. It's
Gotcha.
we have to do a 6-month long stay in the U.S. for Social Security.
Okay.
To be able to qualify for an exemption so that we don't have to pay Social Security in both the U.S. and South Korea. That means every 5 years we have to come back for 6 months.
Okay. I was just in Seoul and came home out on Monday.
Oh, no kidding.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah, weather is gorgeous.
Oh, yeah.
Couple rounds of golf in.
Oh, yeah.
This is great. Yeah.
That's right. I heard it's starting to get chilly there.
Yeah, in the evening it's in the 40s, but 70 during the day.
Apparently in Philadelphia it's warm.
Yeah, I saw that on TV. Yeah. People at the ball games and you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. You're hitting a usually nice. Weather. We were in one day of when we played golf north of Seoul, northwest of Seoul. It was, the trees were clearly changing. Had
So
changed.
if you want to plug that in, it should literally be plug and play.
Yeah. That's what mine was.
And then from here,
That's just arrows.
yes,
Beautiful.
And then, David,
Got it.
there was a box of stuff about Kurt that we put in there, but I don't know where in there, on Tuesday, do you remember, or Wednesday?
I have no idea. Sorry, that was, so it's definitely fall in Seoul, and it feels like it.
Oh, yeah.
Like very much
It
so
had like
northeast
postcards of
the US.
him,
Right.
and letters, and you said I'm gonna put it right back in there.
And I did.
Oh, yeah.
The orange and yellow leaves.
Yes. Yeah. The change of colors. is
Really remarkable. Yeah.
There's the kind
Put
of
it back here.
smaller
so we
maple
can
trees,
look.
but then that ginkgo as well with a bright red yellow.
Mhm.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I took a lot of nice pictures.
Yes. There was the apartment where we lived in Korea. Hello, come on in.
Howdy.
Yeah, I think the apartment where we lived is a large city park, green forest. That's just a nice little walk through the middle. And they also have 2 hills on each side with paths. It's just the colors changing. And then in the spring, there's the cherry blossom trees.
I won't sit in front of you, so you
It looks similar to cherry blossom.
Well, she's gonna look that way anyway, so it's at the
South Korea for 9 years.
But fortunately, you can look across like that, so we're not gonna be.
Was there a time?
Let's go in 2 minutes. Okay? Oh,
And
sorry.
if it's a small group, I'll just stay sitting down.
Okay, yeah, we could rearrange chairs
Yeah,
if
just
we
do much
need,
more.
and, yeah.
Much more,
It was supposed to be a fire.
Yeah, you guys can come around the fire. That would be much more comfortable.
I mean, they're not these days.
Yeah.
If he's here to say.
no idea. And then the informal women's Bible study group was here.
What are you looking for?
We're looking for a box full of Kurt's stuff. Do you want to get the petition out at least?
Oh.
That's
what
Kurt had a box of stuff here?
Yeah.
What
And
does it look like?
we left it in the kitchen on Tuesday, yeah.
Huh. What did it look like?
It's a small brown box,
Okay.
nondescript,
Okay.
mailed to me.
right back.
So I've seen you around, I mean, we visited, we've been around a few times, but I've seen you, I think in the sense that, you remember the church, you've been a long time member? Or? Wow. Wasn't even born then. No, I'm joking.
Come on.
Oh, I see, yeah. No, I think I've seen you one of the two of the times I've been here.
Another level of.
I have a sense of looking at people and remembering. Hey, Jefferson, how you doing? Good, how are you? Good, thanks.
What's up, boss?
Yeah,
We're doing great.
you live in,
Everything's up and running. There you go.
good, doing good.
Yeah, we had a box.
Wonderful.
On Tuesday, we left the box back here. I don't know whether,
Okay.
Box of what?
It's fine, if we can't find it, it's fine, it's just.
we had some stuff for Kurt,
It's a complicated thing.
and somebody moved it.
Who that could be?
Go out and
Sure, they were gonna begin with.
go around.
I'm a Presbyterian.
Cartoon, damned if you do, and damned if you don't.
I was in law school. What was in the box?
Some promotional material. Nothing that we're gonna live or die on, you know.
That's the annoying thing. When we come to a staff meeting, we really should raise hell about stuff like that, because sometimes, I mean, not sometimes, all the time, it's just annoying. Somebody has to move it, and somebody has to be told that, you know, if you move something, say where you moved it to, you know?
Just actually act like you're not alone in this place, right? You know, and so anyway, all of this stuff is up and running. We're plugged in, and I'm great. Grateful we're ready. It was a long service.
Yeah.
But it was a beautiful service. Here's my girlfriend.
He's my boyfriend.
Now that makes my day, Fanny Lee.
I moved this forward so it'll hear better.
Brother, I always noticed you. You're always working to help Dave out. And I'm serious about dinner. Even if it's,
So I know there are folks who are walking, but just to honor your time and to honor Kurt's time, we're going to get started. I'm excited you all got to hear Kurt preach, and so I'm excited to hear a little bit more about what he has to share, but also to hear what questions you all might have, right? So to kind of have a bit of a dialogue. Kurt said it's a smaller group, he's just gonna sit and it'll be more conversational. There is the petition that you'll talk more about, right?
Yeah.
And let's just say a word of prayer before we get started. God of peace, come into our lives and into our world, that we might be peacemakers in all that we do. Thank you for Kurt and Hyeyoung and Sun and for their ministry in Korea. Help us to work alongside them for the reconciliation of people. In your name we pray. Amen.
So, welcome. Thanks. Thank you all for coming to hear more, and hopefully you brought some good questions. So I'll just, instead of giving a full-on presentation thing, since you heard a lot of the details in my sermon, I'll skip through a lot of this and just tell you some of the basics of some of the pictures you see here. This is Joanne will recognize this. Or anyone else who's familiar with Korean foods. Yeah, this is kimchi. So that's the radish. No chopstick, no noodles, no myeon, just the mu. Kimchi. Yeah, just radish. Getting ready. This is our 2 young adult volunteers here at the top, and so this was one of the first things they did as they arrived in Korea and being immersed into a community, and then having to help figure out how to make kimchi for the community. They call it kimjang. So they're trying to work with Korean harmony, the grandmothers, and they don't know much Korean, and then the harmony don't know much English, and I apparently heard they also disagree about how to make the kimchi, so they were hearing one thing from one woman and then another thing from the other, and trying to, not understanding it, but working on To me, that's a good illustration of kind of what it looks like to bridge differences, to bring people who have been far apart, who have been separated, and to come back in. It's a little messy, but if you do it with an open heart, a lot of transformation can occur. Right? So that's one thing that we try to do for our Yavs. We also take them on, I mentioned the sermon, we take them on some study trips. This is a trip that we went to Jeju Island. So this is one of the exhibitions throughout the island talking about the massacres that began in 1948. That was 2 years before the Korean War began, when the South Korean military and the US started massacring people on Jeju Island off the southern tip of South Korea because they weren't willing to support the elections that the US forced on them. And so we talk about that and the roles that some Christians played in Christians carrying out some parts of the massacres as well. But so we help give them a full context of why they're doing the kind of work they're doing and why the Koreans that they're living and working alongside are working for peace and reconciliation. But we also have placements like an alternative school. So this is a high school in southern Jeolla province, almost off the southern tip of the peninsula. But there, we try to focus on making sure they're not just teachers, so they're not just the smart ones with the intelligence and teaching the poor Koreans who aren't as smart as we are. So the Koreans are always the students, they're always the teachers. In this school, we make sure that the majority of their activities are learning in classes alongside the students with them. So they're learning about Korean culture, Korean art. They're learning Korean traditional drums, so learning how to play changu and puk and things, and learning how Koreans handle like tea ceremonies and things of that sort. And then also learning about organic farming along with the students there. So developing a community and learning alongside Korean. So then the U.S. young adults come and have these experiences and these learnings, and then take that back to the U.S., bring it back to the U.S. when they return. We also had a very special opportunity, especially this last year as we were in Seoul, and there were quite a few other ecumenical co-workers from other countries around. So we started creating discussion groups. Once a week we would meet and talk about Northeast Asia issues or Korea-specific issues or history or things that different projects in particular that the Korean Church is working on. And this group involves ecumenical co-workers from Canada, from the US, and from Germany, as well as Japan and Korea. And so even Korean Americans are involved. But this was one of the sessions where we talked about the Korea Peace Appeal, which is the campaign that I mentioned in my sermon that the NCCK is working on.
Which one's your wife?
Right. So Hyeyoung, my married partner, is here. Hyeyoung. And then another Peace USA mission co-worker is Eunju Lee, Reverend Eunju Lee, who's one of the 3 regional liaisons for East Asia. So it's good to know. But the Korea Peace Appeal goes into my work. So I told you I work for the NCCK, Ecumenical Council, and the meetings as I was working with the NCCK, then and they got to where they felt like they could trust me, then they suggested that I be appointed as coordinator of the Ecumenical Forum for Korea. And so this is a picture of the meeting that we had in Bangkok, Thailand, and this is the chair of the Korean Christian Federation. So his name is Kang Myung-chul Kang Moksanin. So he's a reverend, and he's a pastor of a church in Pyongyang, in North Korea, and chair of the Korean Christian Federation. So that's a federation that is officially recognized by the North Korean government and is allowed to be Christian, allowed to worship, and allowed to do all those things. So they're allowed to come and meet us, and I've heard him give several sermons, and we pray together and worship together and cry together and all that, have conversations about strategy and trying to figure out what it looks like. This is a little bit of what our strategizing sessions look like in the EFK. So this is the South Koreans and the North Koreans together at one table. And then behind you see a lot of our other international partners. So there's churches from Germany and Scotland and England and Canada and the US and Taiwan and the Philippines, who also all come and talk to try to figure out how to pool our resources and pool our voices together to try to have some influence on US policy. Especially in the last couple of years, there was a lot of hope that the peace process was going to move forward. And the NCCK saw the South Korean president and the North Korean President Kim Jong-un coming together and making exactly the kind of agreements and projects that the NCCK has been asking for, the kind of small, gradual steps where each side disarms a little bit and they create cooperation projects that they can cooperate on together, so that they start, South Koreans start working with North Koreans and say, oh no, we can actually trust these guys, this is moving forward. So all of that was moving forward until the US came in and had to use what is right now their authority. Because since the Korean Peninsula, since it's a current state of war, the US military has command authority over the South Korean military. So the South Korean military is not an independent military. The South Korean president is not commander-in-chief right now of the South Korean military. So any major decision that South Korean military has to take, they have to first get approval from the US military. And so once they started trying to have large projects, especially a joint rail project, where they're going to repair the rail line that went from Pyongyang to Seoul, that's when the US military came in and said, well, we're not supporting this anymore. This is not what we agreed to. And that really began the end of the momentum. So up until that point, there was a lot of positive momentum in every step. The NCCK was saying that, yes, this is exactly what we've been asking for. This is all good stuff. And then it all ended in 2019.
When in 2019?
Yeah.
When in 2019?
That was, the joint rail project was shut down by the US a little bit before, like early 2019. But it was really the Hanoi summit that after that, everything shut down, everything ended. And it was kind of a buildup of, the US said that they're going to restart the joint military exercises, that President Moon Jae-in was trying to persuade the US to stop the military exercises, or at least pause them while they're in the middle of negotiations and discussions, and then hopefully those negotiations would then start moving toward disarmament, so there would be no need for restarting the military exercises. But the US restarted them again anyway, because they have the authority to do so. And so that led up to a lot of questioning and more distrust building up the Hanoi summit, when the US had said that they were going to do gradual, we'll do a little step by step, you move and then we'll move a little bit, you move a little bit. And then in Hanoi, they came in saying, you give up everything and surrender, and then we'll start to change some of our sanctions and our policies and our military exercises, and then we'll stop increasing our weapons, sort of things. And so that, for North Korea, they said it would be crazy for North Korea to have accepted that kind of a deal, so the deal was off. And so now, North Korea is sitting around waiting to see whether or not the US can give a kind of authentic sign. Like, now they need more than just words to promise that they're interested in these kind of authentic gradual steps. But unfortunately, the US is unwilling to do that.
So who are those two individuals taking it?
So these are I'm not sure exactly their positions or titles, but they're in charge of crews at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone border, so right around the joint security area. And so this picture was taken when they had made a joint military agreement, and the first step of that was that North Korea and South Korea would both demolish guard posts along the DMZ border. So they would get rid of some of the places where they put soldiers ready, pointing guns ready to shoot at each other if need be.
Yeah,
and they said,
I had to serve with the army 3 years.
When you were in military service.
We call it, the city name is Hyeyoung.
That's Hyeyoung.
Nearby over there.
Yeah.
North Korea, South Korea.
In Hyeyoung. Yeah, so you recognize this area, yeah. So That was one of the parts where it was kind of a small disarmament that South Korea could agree to without needing the US to give full approval. So that South Korea was like, we're gonna try to do everything we can where we don't need US approval, and then finally we'll try to convince the US to approve it. But so that was approved, and so they both carried those out. Guard posts were dismantled. It was a sign of, we are both ready to disarm together and start to decrease military hostilities. But that was the hope, and then the hopes were dashed. But so that's why, in that context, the NCCK is working on this peace campaign. The Korea Peace Appeal is what it's called. So the NCCK before was doing its own sort of Christian-based advocacy campaign, specifically asking for a peace treaty, and then they were talking to a lot of other non-governmental organizations who were all working separately, and they were all frustrated, all sort of seeing that agreeing that the US has really become the biggest obstacle to the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. So how do we, maybe if we all come together and have a bigger, one united voice, that might have some influence to change policymakers, decision makers in Washington, DC. And so that's what they're pushing for at the moment. So they have a target of getting around a million signatures from around the world, especially NCCK has promised to reach out to Christian partners in particular to see how many Christian signatures we can add to the peace appeal. And so it's, for me, it's an important sign of solidarity for Koreans who are starting to feel forgotten, to feel ignored and frustrated that the president that they elected had his policies blocked by the U.S. And now it's turned back to the other political parties in charge, who has brought back in increase of hostilities and saying we're going to consider preemptive strike again for the first time. And that's so North Korea has reacted as anticipated. And so now it's back to the tit for tat. But in the meantime, we keep trying to gather support for a different way, a middle way.
That is instead of in Korean called the Mindan.
Yeah.
Can you understand Mindan? Mindan, and that means that, associate, established by one of former professor of UC Berkeley, Song, and he just, tried to organize to unify this in Korea beyond the political power. Yeah, it's very strong. That's why in this area, Koreans, including me, some of the past of the church, they just, they are involved in the development. And this describes, I got PhD on the Old Testament for reunification of Korea.
All right.
Yes, for many years around. But they are just the 8th century prophet, Amos, Malachi, the Amos, Hosea.
Right.
That is in terms of the Amharic in Hebrew.
Amharic, is that a journal?
No, Hebrew. Amharic. That's meaning that Minjung.
Right.
Remnant.
Right.
You know
right.
Minjung.
I know Minjung, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is one of the concepts. Another, Pastor Cho, the Korean
is that a
church in JVC, he also got PhD from GTU, Credit Union, for unification of Korea, in Old Testament, reflecting the Deuteronomy. I'm a 8th century prophet, is Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. End of COVID.
Right, and ending the Korean. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
I couldn't gather what you were saying. I'm sorry, because it was a little soft. Could you just summarize what he was saying?
Yeah, he was talking about, so he's done, you're a professor of Old Testament? Retired, he's a professor of Old Testament, but a lot of his studies in Old Testament interpretation focused on, for example, reunification. So looking at the old prophets. Then he talked about another Pastor Cho. Cho Eun-suk, who was also studying Deuteronomy, right? Studying the Pentateuch, but also looking at sort of Deuteronomy stories from the perspective of what that means for unification. So yeah, there are a lot of people around who are doing a lot of different ways to try to think about this. And one of the tricks that NCCK is working on is how to bring them all together and increase the understanding in the communities where they are as well. As we find, like, as many people, there are hundreds of thousands of people working on having these conversations, but still the majority of US Americans have no idea about any of the stuff that I just talked about, right? Or any of the things that I mentioned in my sermon. For me, that's, I'm a mission coworker, you know, like, we don't call them missionaries anymore. Because in the past, missionaries really did focus a lot more on telling at and speaking to and teaching, you know, the people who are not as intelligent. So as a mission coworker, I feel like my mission is to go and learn from Koreans like yourself, learn for, you know, what is it that they're talking, what are they struggling on? And then when I learn that, then I bring that back to the US, almost kind of in a reverse mission sense. So I'm really here to change the US. Yeah.
Kim Jong-un, that's a present world leader of Korea. Is it Kim Jong-un? Is it on?
Kim Jong-un, yeah, of North Korea. Right.
Is he involved with this Presbyterian Church peacemaking thing? Peacemaking pact?
He doesn't have any personal involvement.
None?
So, right. So he's not a part of the Korean Christian Federation.
But neither does the South Korean president, right?
Yeah, the South Korean president, was a Christian. Did participate in church. He was Methodist, I think. Now I'm sorry. Now I'm all of a sudden confused as to whether he was Methodist or Catholic. But one thing the South Korean government has said in meetings with the NCCK is a lot of the NCCK's work, especially in the 1980s for reunification, inspired the agreements that the South Korean Unification Ministry was making with North Korea. So it was the NCCK who first published statements about saying we should talk about reunification in a non-forceful way. Because for the most part, most South Koreans, when they think of reunification, they think of conquering North Korea and forcing them into government like South Korea. And so the NCCK published a statement in 1988 focusing on that the people of Korea should be in charge of any decisions to end the war or reunification, and not the US or Russia or Soviet Union or China, and that it should be a gradual friendly reunification where the leadership of both countries are working with each other in conversation. And the South Korean government, when they created the June 15th statement in 2002, said that the points that the NCCK made in their statement inspired several of the exact points that were made in the agreement between them and North Korea. But yes?
Is the United States still at war with Korea? Is that true peace? Is it still a war with Korea?
Right, so the war is still on. And the US is still using wartime as a way to maintain authority over the South Korean military.
Are they involved with any other countries at war with Korea? And so which ones?
The US is the only non-Korean country that's still actively involved in the Korean War. So Russia left a long time ago. China has no active involvement other than being part of some of the discussions. But the US is the only foreign military that still has a presence. We have 28,500 soldiers stationed in South Korea, and then another 30,000 stationed in Japan, which if you know where Japan is right on the outside of Korea, and then there's South Korea. So we have this huge, at least the front where we can maintain a siege, basically, is what we're maintaining against North Korea. So there's Russia further up north, and then China is on the other side. But so we've got the rest of the Pacific Ocean. We've cut off North Korea from the rest of the Pacific Ocean through the biggest presence of U.S. military anywhere else outside of the U.S. itself.
How about Vietnam? We still at war with Vietnam, or do we have true peace with Vietnam?
See, we have a treaty that we've agreed to with Vietnam, but we haven't yet been able to create a treaty or an agreement with North Korea. That's part of the
How about
frustration.
Vietnam? Are we at true peace with Vietnam?
To say true peace, that would be beyond my beyond my ability to say, because I feel like true peace is, that's not until we're all working together for each other's health and wholeness, right? And that's something we can work toward, but definitely we haven't reached that place with Vietnam either. But
we're not at war, but we haven't settled true peace yet.
Right.
we're
It's not
at
really
war, but
active war. It's
no
not really
troops.
active war, but we still haven't settled true peace yet.
Right. Not open fighting, but
Can you clarify what was signed for the Korean War to stop at least some of the actual violent,
right.
Yeah.
So 1953, the armistice was signed, an armistice ceasefire agreement. And in that armistice, so that was signed by the U.S. On behalf of the UN command, which is not exactly the United Nations, because the United Nations didn't create a project or ministry for that. So the U.S. and North Korea and China signed that. So the South Korea did not sign the treaty at the time, and there's a couple of different factors for that. One of the reasons is because the South Korean president at the time didn't want to have a ceasefire. He wanted to keep fighting to destroy North Korea and then take it over for himself. And so, but also because the U.S. Was and is the authority over the South Korean military. So if the U.S. signs it, that means it's for the South Korean military too. But in that armistice agreement, they said, in 6 months we will return and have negotiations to sign a peace treaty to completely end the war. But that never happened. There was a number of military movements, and especially the U.S. Decided they were going to bring in nuclear weapons. So we placed nuclear missiles on the Korean Peninsula in South Korea. And then that, for North Korea meant, okay, that means the agreements that we made in the ceasefire to move toward a peace treaty make no sense anymore. So then North Korea said, it's time to start considering what it would take for us to create our own nuclear weapons in response. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the religious makeup of South Korea, Christianity, and is there Buddhism or other religions?
Right. So you could say that if you consider South Korea as a whole, especially in terms of talking about the background, most religious understandings are either Buddhist or Confucian or a kind of mix of that. But the people who are willing to actively identify as that, so people who will say on the census, I am Buddhist, has been shrinking dramatically. So before, people who identified as Buddhist were a larger number than people who identified as Christian. But in 2015, for the first time, Buddhism became smaller. So they're now around only 18% of the population who's willing to say I identify as Buddhist on the census. And then for Christians, counting Catholic and Protestant together, they're around 32% of the Korean population, South Korean population. But the largest group, which becoming similar to the United States, is the people who don't identify with any religion at all. And that's the one that's growing faster. Before, the Christian numbers were growing fairly steadily, but in the last 10 years, that stopped, and then in the last 5 years, it's starting to shrink now. So for the first time, Christian numbers in South Korea are starting to shrink. I want to see if there's other people who have questions, but I'll come back to you if you don't mind. Are there any other questions?
So I, just to understand the history a little bit. I mean, I understand the Korean War back then, I suppose one could say, 50s. But what gives the US authority today to have that kind of power over South Korea?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of almost, that's a sort of a new tweak for me that I didn't quite get, you know?
That was because of the Mutual Defense Treaty that was signed in 1952, before the armistice was signed. That said that so long as Korea is in a wartime situation, the US military will have command authority over all forces. And that simply never changed. So that has been constant since then. And it was solidified with the Status of Forces Agreement, the SOFA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that brings up another thought I had in what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
This war language,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it doesn't sound to me, from what I know about the situation there, that those two countries are at war with each other. So that sort of gets back to this thing about authority. Some people are calling it a war, but other people are perhaps not calling it a war. These are just two countries with two different ideologies, same people, you know, family. You know, it's like your sermon this morning. But so it seems like the United States is still seeing this as a war, and some people are, and therefore justifying that authority. I don't get that all. Something like that, I don't get it.
Yeah, like you could say in some ways it's legal language. So then the U.S. uses that as a legitimize the fact that they are in actual control of the border itself, the border between North and South Korea. So any South Koreans who want to go through the border to go visit North Korea have to have express approval, not from South Korea, but from the U.S. And so it's the U.S. soldiers' presence that are physically blocking things, for example. And so in some ways you could say, like, to what extent is that an actual war or not? There's this sort of legalese that the U.S. is using, but then there's also the actual actions of threat. So for example, that we carry out joint military exercises with South Korea several times a year where we practice invading North Korea. Our militaries come together, practice invading. We practice assassination strikes against North Korea several times a year, right outside North Korea's border. And the U.S. constantly says, oh, we promise this is all defensive in nature, and this is not hostile at all. But you know, for us in the U.S., you imagine if China had made a military agreement with Mexico and then started having exercises on the other side of the southern border of the U.S., you know, would the U.S. still say, well, it's okay because it's defensive in nature? You know, of course not. There would be a massive uproar. So the U.S. is taking all of these actions that say we are still on a war footing. We are ready to invade you. We also now have, unfortunately, since George W. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, we also have a precedent for carrying out preemptive strikes before anyone attacks us. And at that time, George W. Bush invaded Iraq and then said to North Korea, hey, you're part of the axis of evil too, so you better behave, thinking that that would scare the poor, you know, not weaker North Koreans. But instead, what actually happened was North Korea said, we need nuclear weapons now. Because if Iraq had nuclear weapons, maybe the U.S. wouldn't have invaded them. So we need nuclear weapons now to make sure that that doesn't happen to us, just like they threatened. Like actually threatening. So 2003 to 2006 was the first nuclear test. So it's that mix of like, yeah, not exactly, but kind of still. And then the resources that are all directed away from the welfare of the people, both in South Korea and North Korea, and the fact that dictatorship lasted in South Korea until 1998. Really, that was the first time the opposite party was able to win the presidency. You know, so all those things are a part of that. It's not full-out war, but it's a situation of war, and everybody's minds is on war. But no. Did you still have a question?
I was just going to say, for the second time in a week or two, I'm struck by our ignorance about the rest of the world. I love your questions and I love your comments, because it's appalling to me how little we know about our government's involvement in huge parts of the world that don't seem to make any sense. It's not, and I'm actually thinking that when the conversation happens about Korea, it's always about North Korea, and it's always in a very negative way. We just refuse to even talk about this person in any sort of reasonable language. When I actually am sitting here listening, I feel terrible for the North Korean people, because they've got to be the loneliest country in that area, because they're isolated, and it's because of our government.
Right, right. I think for me, and I also want to be clear that I don't want to minimize the seriousness of like human rights violations, right? Or the kinds of policies that centralize authority or that seek unity. That to me is something, I want to try to figure out what's the best way to end that kind of a situation. What kind of strategy would be most likely to make it so that no one turns to human rights violations, including South Korea, because that's what we did in 1945. Violating human rights in order to secure our power and authority. But how do we get to where everyone feels safe enough that their self-determination and autonomy is not threatened, so that they can say, let's start talking to each other on an equal footing. And so for me, I want to consider all of we're told that North Korea is doing these things because they're evil or because they want attention or what. But for me, I see them as a symptom of the ongoing policy of us having authority and control over the Korean Peninsula and seeking to make sure that we have, for example, access for our businesses and our markets throughout Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you.
South Koreans called America as a 미국, that's meaningless of beautiful country. Why? In 1945, North Koreans helped by the China. All of the soldiers came down to South Korea. At that time, United States and armies came over, save, protect in South Korea. That's why Korean, even young generation today, they call the America 미국, that means beautiful country, which save our lives. So, in North Korea, Kim Jong-un president, he understands liberation, humanism. He educated Switzerland. Yeah, I've been there, Julie University for 6 months to understand what education system in Switzerland is so beautiful, liberation, freedom. You can see over there in the town there is watching, and all of the mayors of the city, Switzerland, women, female. But, young man, Kim Jong-un went back to his country, North Korea, after he graduated high school and, junior college. He cannot control the conservative, the socialism, especially involved into China. So,
yeah, makes it.
Even he tried to invite a professor of Stanford University many years before, coronavirus. Usually, around 20 professors of Stanford University invited by the North Korea. He tried to understand,
Right.
Yeah, but, I think it's what do you think about the power, international power? China? And I don't know.
Right. For those of you, in case you couldn't fully understand, one of the things he talked about, one of the signs that Koreans have a positive understanding of the U.S. is they call U.S. 미국, and so in Korean, 미인 means like beautiful. 미인 means beautiful person, but so mi is a word for beautiful, comes from Chinese. That's one I've heard. I've also heard another reason for the mi is that it's the way Chinese wrote Americans was mi, and then it comes from me. So I don't know which one is the most accurate, but he's talking about there is a lot of positive feelings toward the U.S. But that some of those positive feelings are also in North Korea. So he talked about Kim Jong-un, the current chair, the president of North Korea, was studied in Switzerland and studied in Europe, so knows quite well capitalist societies and has experienced a lot of the benefits of that. And so when Kim Jong-un came to power, it was tricky because there are a lot of people in North Korea who are still quite extreme. And so it's a difficult work for Kim Jong-un to come in, even if he has some interest in reform or interest in changing. He also has to convince the old guard in North Korea. And so that's why a lot of the changes that he has been making in North Korea have been very, very slow and very gradual. But Kim Jong-un has brought in change from North Korea. And the professor also mentioned that North Korea regularly extends invitations to professors from universities like Stanford University to come and to have conversations with North Korean leadership to try to develop understanding. Because North Korea, in a sense, they may be in a desperate situation, but they have been making overtures, reaching out, saying, we can do this in a more peaceful way. But at the same time also saying, we're not going to just leave ourselves open and vulnerable to a U.S. preemptive campaign of regime change also. So for me, it's hard to imagine what would it be like if I were advising Kim Jong-un, in North Korea. Okay, how do you make sure that the U.S. doesn't launch a preemptive attack, but you also convince all the old guard whose bodies were maimed by U.S. military in the Korean War, who saw the carpet bombing campaigns, who are still based on that revenge. How do you convince all of them to move toward understanding and dialogue as well? Unfortunately, I feel like that got a lot harder after the breakdown in the negotiations in 2019, because at that time the U.S. was promising we'll do gradual, small steps, and then they went into Hanoi and said, actually, you're going to have to give up everything and completely surrender, or else we won't change anything. And so Kim Jong-un lost a lot of face when he went back to North Korea after that, because he had done a lot of work to convince other North Koreans who weren't sure if they should trust him to go into these meetings with the U.S., and then he came back completely empty-handed, almost bamboozled, you could say. And so now it's going to be, well, I don't know. I don't want to believe it's impossible, but it's going to be awfully difficult to reconvince them again without some authentic signs of saying we really are interested in gradual step-by-step dialogue. But so as your question, that I think part of what makes the situation so difficult and so complex is that there's still so much focus on outside powers, which constantly takes the decision-making authority away from Koreans on the peninsula themselves. So the Koreans are constantly having their decision taken away by the US and China saying, well, we're not quite ready to agree with each other. So Koreans, you just have to wait, I'm sorry, kind of thing. What could it mean for us as one of those powers that has even more hands in the pie in Korea, more hands than China has. China is not present on the Korean Peninsula, the US is. So what does that mean for us to say we can live into a space where none of us outside powers have the ability to take away decision-making authority from Koreans on the peninsula? But that's hard. Yes?
Okay, my problem is, everything I hear is more details pop to my mind, so I'm not sure how much of this is useless, but 20, 30 years ago, surprisingly, the largest, possibly any Protestant congregation was a Presbyterian church in Seoul. The congregation, but that's 20, 30 years ago. I'm wondering about the sister of Kim Jong-un and the fact that he seemed to have been out of circulation and lost weight, and that is she possibly scarier than Kim Jong-un. I'm thinking that something that I've almost forgotten, that South Korea, under a military dictator for a while, it was worse than I ever thought, that thousands of students were actually killed in South Korea, and I forgot the guy's name. I'm really curious, the chance for culture questions of how to say correctly Hanguk, and is it Chosen, and does Chosen come from Chaosen, and is that morning calm? I don't know. Yeah, I've heard that Meiguo is the Chinese, and that's supposed to be a beautiful goat on a hill, so that's that, but also the America thing. There's 100 other things I heard and thought of, but yeah, I was really curious about any of those. And like, yeah, repeat it, because I'm assuming I don't really know how to say it.
Right. Right, okay, that's a lot of questions. I might be able to answer every single one of them. But I think it's always interesting watching who comes in and out of leadership in North Korea, and people coming in and out of the spotlight. So I haven't learned a whole lot specifically about Kim Jong-un's sister. So I don't know as much about her, what would you say, approach. But I do, as he was working on reforms and changes, his sister was one of the ones brought in to affect a lot of those changes, which is interesting to me. And she's also been moved around to different kind of positions in leadership, and I'm not as familiar with where she is now. I haven't heard a lot recently. In terms of how often you might see leaders like Kim Jong-un in media or in pictures and things, I think for us it's important to be careful that we don't make too many assumptions about what that might mean. There are a lot of people, for example, in South Korea, there are agents and groups who want to capitalize on any kind of change or any sort of difference, and then will start rumors about this must mean that Kim Jong-un is about to die and he's really sick and he must be in a terrible situation and won't be, and then the next week he appears again at another event, and the most likely answer is probably pretty simple, and there's something else going on, and he wasn't able to attend an event for this or that. So I think it's important to take all the claims about what's happening with the state of North Korean leadership with a grain of salt. It's...
I just want to say, I figured we actually didn't know anything going on in North Korea, or at least the American public, so it sounded like, gee, we actually know more than I thought we knew.
We do know, we have had mission, PCUSA has had a mission coworker stationed in Pyongyang, North Korea for years. Up until about 2014, when that mission coworker retired, and then we weren't able to fill the position at that time. There was a lot of changes going on. But there are quite a few there are quite a few countries, even countries that are capitalist and friends with us, who have embassies, who have offices in Pyongyang, who had people working there up until the pandemic. And there are humanitarian aid organizations, interfaith organizations, ecumenical organizations, church groups. The Church of Finland had an office, had projects going on in North Korea up until 2019, and the US changed sanctions policy and then created the travel ban for US citizens to go in. But they had been working, like the Church of Finland was working on a project with North Korean schools, having people from Finland, teachers, educators from Finland come and help North Koreans talk about reforming their curriculum, their school curriculum. So Europeans having access and influence in North Korean education policy is a pretty major deal. But because of US sanctions, the Finnish church basically their bank said, if so long as you have an office in Pyongyang, we can't continue holding your bank account because the U.S. Treasury is coming and telling us that we may be violating sanctions by holding onto your account. So the Finn Church Aid has pulled out and shut down. But so there were a lot of people that had this kind of access into North Korea or regularly interacting with North Koreans. I almost had my chance to go into North Korea myself in 2019, but then we heard the State Department had said that there's a travel ban, but humanitarian aid organizations are exempt. But then we went to go talk to them about how likely they were to approve our exemption. They said, well, no, we're not going to approve that. So they say there's exemptions, but actually they're blocking. And so a lot of other U.S. humanitarian aid organizations have also found themselves completely blocked from carrying out projects that had been going on in North Korea, unfortunately. So that's one of the we're almost up.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, that was just for my last point, to say that was one of the most important policies for me as a U.S. citizen to try to figure out how to change in Washington, D.C. to end the travel ban that's blocking U.S. citizens from being able to go into North Korea. I feel like that's like one step that there might be some hope, even though every time we talk to the State Department, they really don't like us or agree with us. But I feel like that's one piece that could possibly be changed sooner rather than later.
Okay, so two things. First, I want Kurt to share with us, maybe as U.S. citizens, what might be something we could do, like who do we even write to about a travel ban?
Right.
And then could you share a little bit about what's on this table, because we found the stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And then we'll wrap up.
Right, so in the PCUSA, the Office of Public Witness has been involved in a lot of the conversations with other ecumenical partners who are doing projects with North Korea. So they've been trying to have conversations with the State Department and with the Biden presidential administration to try to figure out how to make sure that the travel ban is not renewed the next time it's up for expiration.
When is
So the Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C., our own Presbyterians are one way to reach out to say, who are they talking to right now where we could send letters to or make a phone call to. That's an important part. And then I'm also working with the ministry to the United Nations to talk through what it means to talk about sanctions and how, as Christians, we should address sanctions regimes and how, for example, how tight can sanctions be, and if sanctions are literally killing people. So our current U.S. and international sanctions are killing an estimated of 5,000 North Koreans every year. So suppose that the war has ceased, but we are actively creating policies that kill North Koreans at the moment. So what does that mean as Christians to participate in a sanctions regime, and what responsibility do we have to change that? So both the Office of Public Witness in DC and the Ministry to the United Nations in New York are important avenues where Presbyterians can join our voices with other Presbyterians trying to talk through what that means for us. And sorry, we're all out of time for questions, but so I just want to show you, as you're on your way out, you can pick up a few prayer cards. This is kind of an old picture of my family, but our son, San, his name's Han, means mountain in Korean. But you can pick up these prayer cards that have a little bit of our information, and then a larger, this is a profile that also has a good description of our information. And then make sure, if you can, before you leave, add your name and your signature to these pages for the Korea Peace Appeal, and then I will forward them. I'll send them to the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program so that we get a sense of how many Presbyterians are signing, and then Carl Horton at the Peacemaking Program will forward that on to our partners in Korea.
Are there online signatures, or does it all have to be in?
Yes, and that maybe the best way to do that is to share the link. I'll send the link to Joanne so that she can forward it. But that's also the link. If you want to write it down now, in the KoreanWar.net will take you to this webpage for the Korea Peace Appeal, and then you can just click down here, sign here, And that'll take you to a page where you can fill out your name and information. And then affiliation, make sure you put Presbyterian Church USA so that the NCCK knows how many Christian signatures we're getting. But there's also a lot more. If you go to this website, you can click on action or appeal to read a lot more information and ways that people are helping out in the campaign. But thank you all. I appreciate you guys giving me the space and appreciate all the excellent questions that led to a really good conversation. So I hope to keep. Oh, sure.
You read this stuff. Oh my gosh, I don't give.
This looks like we recorded this talk.
And put a smile on my face. I'm gonna wear it on Sunday.
Especially, but
Just in case anybody has anything to say, I'll just say. There you go, especially after the sermon today. Thank you, honey.
Yeah,
But how do you get everybody else to hear it?
See what Mary Harper brought me?
Forgive Steve!
Where is that from?
No idea. But she's fine. I can't imagine you would ever need this, but just in case.
Quite a lot of help.
It's appropriate for what it's all your fault, but we will forgive you, whatever it is.
Oh my
I'm just citing the petition online right now.
That
was great.
Thanks, man. See you later, okay?
Have shooting